Welcome to Season 2 of Classical Education, a podcast for those who believe in rediscovering the art of asking questions, engaging in conversation, and attending to the ideas at the heart of well-ordered teaching and learning. Adrian Fries and Trey Bailey invite you to join them on a journey in pursuit of the true, the good, and the beautiful as we participate in the great conversation and listen to the many voices coming from the world of classical education. Beautiful Teaching is offering practical tips to launch your homeschool. Join us on Monday, November 7th at 8 p.m. Central for a 90-minute seminar to discuss the ABCs of homeschooling. Lindsay Peterson has spent the last several years earning her master's degree in classical education from the University of Dallas. She was homeschooled, and she has since taught at the grammar level in multiple Dallas area schools and has homeschooled her own children and been instrumental in founding a Charlotte Mason-based homeschool co-op. Participants for this seminar will receive practical tips for launching their homeschool, as well as resource suggestions for educational philosophy, classical curriculum, and homeschool communities. A sample daily schedule for pre-kinder homeschool will also be provided. To register for Lindsay's webinar, go to beautifulteaching.coursestorm.com. That's beautifulteaching.coursestorm.com, or you can visit our podcast website, classicaleducationpodcast.com/courses. Enjoy today's show, and thank you for listening.
It's a great pleasure to be with you and to meet you as well, virtually.
Well, that's right, and thank you. I know that you're suffering a bit of a head cold, so we will keep that in mind. But I'm reminded, just hearing your voice, of the first time I heard your voice, which was virtually. At the time of this recording, I'm just finishing up a day of school, and it's just in the afternoon here, but it's quite late for you, being there at your school in France. And the first time we met was through a mutual friend. And as I recall, I was talking to him about some of our visions for education, in particular, a vision for the education of young men. And I remember discussing with him my desire to read more and learn more about the work of an educator by the name of André Charlier. And he said, well, if you'd like to know more about Charlier, you need to meet my friend Ferdi McDermott and hear about the school that he's running in France. And so you were very generous with your time, and I was eager as soon as we got off the phone to have another conversation. So thank you for being here. And I just wonder, just for the benefit of our listeners here, and for my co-host Adrian, who is meeting you for the first time, could you just tell us your story and how you got involved in education and what sort of brought you to the good work you're doing at your school today?
Sure. Yes, I'll try and keep it reasonably brief. So I'm 50 this year. When I was I went to school in the south of England, in Southampton, at King Edward VI School, Southampton, which is, as its name suggests, is a survival of the Reformation, but with also, if you like, a refoundation of a chantry school that had existed beforehand. So very much in the English grammar school tradition, and it was still that way when I was there in the 80s, very much the end of a tradition. And then I went to university in Edinburgh and studied French and Scandinavian languages and Celtic languages. So it was a linguistic and literary 4 years that I had there. And then I almost went in for the priesthood. I started some formation in the Diocese of Portsmouth and changed my mind pretty quickly. And for want of, how can I put it? I had a desire to do something in the line of culture and education. Having been a Catholic, raised a Catholic, but gone through an Anglican school that I loved and enjoyed. Mm-hmm. And I got involved in two projects in the 90s. publishing Catholic books and publishing a magazine for Catholic schools. I hadn't been to a Catholic school myself. I'd been to an Anglican school. And it was through doing that work for about 5 or 6 years in the 90s that I came to know something about the situation of Catholic schools in the UK. And shall we say, was talked into a crazy project of starting my own school with a few of the people who wrote for our magazine, which was called Mentor, the Catholic Education Journal. Started in 1996 or 1997, and then it continued until 2003. So to cut a long story short, together with 9 colleagues, including a priest and a retired Christian brother, a couple of married couples with their children. I was single then, I'm still single now. We persuaded a French bishop to let us take over an empty junior seminary building in the Vendée, which is in the west of France. And you might say, well, you know, what are all these English people and Australians and Irish setting up a school in the west of France? Well, I suppose at the time in the 90s, a lot of English people were selling up their houses in the south of England and buying castles in France. So we followed in that sort of movement, which was something to do with looking for a slower pace of life, trying to get back to basics, moving out of London into the countryside and so on. But also we were thinking logistically that either we would have to, for the kind of school we wanted to create, either we would have to create it in a big city where there'd be plenty of demand, or we'd have to be a boarding school in the countryside. So this is how we ended up in the west of France, with a local Catholic community that was very keen to welcome us. And also the local government in this part of France was very, very keen on this kind of project. You may know something about the Vendée. It's the part of France that sort of resisted the French Revolution.
Yes.
So that there is a bit of a history of a little bit of a different approach in the Vendée, and that was part of the reason why we ended up settling here 20 years ago, 2001, and the school opened in 2002. Because I had been a publisher before, I hadn't been teaching. I had a couple of other people running the school for me for the first 5 years, and then I took over as headmaster after that, and I've been doing that for the last 15 years. For many years, I was teaching pretty much full-time French literature, English literature, history, a little bit of Latin. But now I'm mainly spending my time trying to find ways to fix the roof.
Sure, that makes sense. Well, I have to confess, Ferdi, that the romantic in me has just fallen in love with your project and your vision, but also with your building. And so I just wonder if you could describe, just if we were to close our eyes and to imagine, as you just sort of paint a picture for us, what your facilities look like, and perhaps even some of the surrounding geography. What is the place that your school is in? What is it like?
Well, Chavagne, which comes from the Latin, dog Latin, if you like, cabanas, cabins, was probably in Roman times a collection of huts and cabins near a Roman villa, which was on an adjacent hill. Our settlement on top of this hill was made up of local tradesmen. Probably there were also tin mines and so on. It's built on granite, so we're on a little hill. The river on either side of the hill, 2 different rivers, on a place that's been settled for several thousand years. In the Middle Ages, in the 12th century, we know that there was a Benedictine monastery on the site where we are now. And I discovered recently that we have 3 boys in the school called de Belleville, whose family gave this land to the church in the 12th century. So
Wow.
there's a great historical link there. And we're in the middle of the French countryside. There are beautiful white cows everywhere. The French love their cows because they love their steak and chips, steak frites. There are lots of small farms, and also most people have their own little vegetable gardens as well. The landscape is full of religious imagery because, rather like perhaps Ireland or Poland or countries like that, or Slovakia or something like that, we're in a part of the world which was very, very pious in the 19th century. And also the clergy were very much on the side of the poor in the time of the revolution here, and were the sort of heroes and leaders of the people, you know. So every corner of every street and every farm has a Calvary or a statue of Our Lady or a little chapel or whatever. So those are all around us. We have 3 chapels. One to St. Joseph, one to Our Lady, and a large one for the school that seats a couple of 200 or 300. A beautiful church organ. And the building is really at the center of a small French town with its 2 boulangeries where you can buy your baguette and your croissant in the morning. And a wine shop where you can go and taste different wines. A butcher shop where you can get all the meat is local. So we're living the French dream in that way. We're certainly in the middle of La Belle France. Lots of windmills as well, because during the French Revolution, the local peasants who were busy fighting for the church and the king against the godless revolutionaries, that was the way they saw it, they would, when the soldiers were coming to burn down their village or whatever, they would turn the sails of the windmill as a kind of semaphore to send messages to the next village. And there are a few places around here where in 1793, 1794, there were big massacres. In 1794, for example, in February, there were 300 or 400 men, women, and children, mostly old men and women and children who were killed in this village. There's a village nearby where there were a few hundred pardoned to the church. The church was set fire to. And the reaction against that persecution of Catholics by the revolution in the 1790s meant that throughout the 1900s, the place was an extremely religious part of France, which sent missionaries all over the world. So we have in our little village 3 convents, for example. There's only about 2,500, 3,000 people in the village, but I would say there are probably about 50 or 60 chapels here. So it's quite unusual in that way.
Well, your explanation of the atmosphere clearly allows your students to experience a very, very full and rich, dynamic experience. I noticed I was watching a video of your school, about your school, and it was just beautiful to hear the stories from some of the students of the impact that it's had on their spiritual life. And something that really, really struck me in watching your video was the amount of the balance of the 3 virtues of the intellect virtue, the moral virtue, and the physical virtues. All 3 seem to be very balanced. And I feel like in a lot of our classical schools today, there's a real strong emphasis on moral virtue and intellectual virtue, but we've lost, or maybe just haven't recaptured in our classical schools today, the importance of physical virtue. But in order,
I don't think that.
Yeah, and I guess
it's not a new problem.
Right. And, well, I guess what I wanted to ask you was, like, in order to really have a good balance of, properly ordering the mind, the body, and the soul of a human being, we really need all 3 virtues. And I would love to hear from you how you can help, and how you do help students to order all three of those virtues, I fear that we've lost, or like maybe haven't really understood the importance of physical virtue. But your video showed such a beautiful balance of the students doing physical activities like horseback riding, ping pong, basketball, canoeing. Like there was so much in addition to the music, in addition to learning chemistry and experiencing it in a rich way. And I really would love to just have you expand on how that makes a huge difference in shaping the whole person.
Well, I can remember when I was about 7 or 8, Adrian and I was at primary school in England, and we were told the story of Alfred the Great. Now, Alfred the Great, in the 9th century, in a period of about 15, 20 years of peace from the Viking invasions, started a sort of educational revolution in England. And one of the things that stayed in my imagination was that he divided his day into 3 parts of 8. So he had 8 hours of prayer and study, 8 hours of physical exercise, and 8 hours of sleep. And he was very keen that he would stick to that rule. I don't know whether he was very successful in it, but he apparently invented a clock. That there was a candle with little pins that would fall out every 8 hours, and in that way, I suppose he's picking up on an aspect of classical education which is often narrowed down to the trivium and the quadrivium, and there's no mention of gymnastics, and music is kind of sidelined and becomes really the study of literature.
That's right. That's right.
But if you actually go back to the classical world, you had to train the body before you could train the mind, and that's. I don't think there was any sort of particular time in history when that was jettisoned, except perhaps if you want to go back to the Enlightenment and the sense of kind of dualism, separating out body and spirit and kind of denigrating the body. Perhaps there might have been some elements of Protestantism that were a denigrating of the body, possibly. But to be honest, the Jesuit schools as well were so thorough in their teaching of classical Latin and Greek and mathematics and so on that physical education and gymnastics and so on didn't get much of a look in for centuries, and that's very much a debate of. Trey mentioned the Charlier brothers. This was very much a debate at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century. To what extent do we need to reconnect with what French philosophers would call le réel, the real, tangible, the physical, from an education that had become a bit disembodied? I would say that we haven't, to be honest, got a very developed philosophy of it. It's just a conviction, really, of mens sana in corpore sano, kind of balance, as you say, between different aspects. But I would say the thing that our school picks up on more than perhaps many other schools is not so much an emphasis on sport and music, but the centrality of prayer. Because a lot of it's sometimes a weakness in Catholic families that they'll go to mass on Sunday with great regularity, but a lot of Catholic families don't pray together at all. Maybe evangelical families might be stronger at that. I don't know, but a lot of people who lead busy lives, if they fall out of the habit of having family meal times, for example. Protestants don't have a tradition really of going to church every day, which has been a Catholic tradition in the past. It's possible to be intellectually Christian but to sort of put that in a different box from school. And Alfred the Great, he was at daily mass. He was, in England, for example, the students in some of these big ecclesiastical foundations like Eton and Winchester and so on, they would be saying the office while they were making their beds. They'd be going to mass every day. They'd be saying the rosary. And this is something that everybody did. And it was at the heart of education. And some of the 19th century revivals, like in rugby school, for example, Dr. Thomas Arnold, they took that view as well, that the worship of God ought to be at the center of every kind of educational endeavor. And if you look at the landscape in England of all of these schools that were built in the 19th century, and there were dozens and dozens of them, they all look like they were built in the Middle Ages.
Mm-hmm.
And in the heart of every single one of them is a chapel that looks like a medieval monastery. And that's the tradition, if you like, that we're sort of tapping into, is that 19th century revival, which in English terms wasn't really Catholic at its heart, although towards the end of the 19th century there were Catholic monks and so on who came and founded Catholic versions of these schools, sort of copied from Dr. Thomas Arnold's rugby. And Newman was part of that too. Newman was, he founded a school and a university. And the idea really there was the Christian Paideia, which is going back to your trivium and quadrivium of the ancients, but also with gymnastics and music and sport and prayer very much at the center. And of course, that's not an English idea, but an Egyptian idea.
Oh, expand on that, please.
Okay, well, Plato, whenever Plato wants you to listen, he'll talk about Egypt, because Egypt for the Greeks was the place where all this mysterious knowledge came from. And writing, for example, came from Egypt, and the first philosophers came from Egypt. But I mean, there's not much evidence of whether or not that's true. But there's a lot of the Greeks saying the influence that they have is from Egypt, and there's evidence that some of them spent time in Egypt. But Saint Mark supposedly went to Alexandria, which was where Greek civilization was flourishing more than it had ever flourished in Athens, and that was the center of Greek civilization in the Christian era. And Alexandria, the greatest library in the ancient world, and so on. And he supposedly, or his community, started a Christian school, or co-op of schools, perhaps, around the great library in Alexandria, based on the Platonic idea of the healthy mind, the healthy body, and the trivium and the quadrivium, but in his view, going on then to philosophy and theology. And it wasn't just for boys, it was for girls as well. Because rather like if you go to a mission country and, the first thing that the Christian missionaries do is they start schools and hospitals. This is what was happening in the early church in Egypt. The Christians were saying, one of the great things we're going to get from being Christians is we're going to be educated. And this is part of the fullness of life that comes from, the light of Christ. And so this idea that everybody could be educated, boys and girls, was happening in Alexandria already in the 2nd century, and we know quite a lot about it. We know even about their curriculum, because St. Clement of Alexandria wrote quite a lot about it. That's really the education that people like Arnold and to a certain extent Newman were trying to rehabilitate, even though it had perhaps been a bit sidelined. But in terms of the trivium and the quadrivium, it was that tradition from the Greek and Roman tradition filtered through the Christian community in Egypt, which was at the basis of all education in Europe. Because if you look at people like St. Patrick, who came to Ireland, you look at the Benedictines, all of these people were influenced by the monastic traditions of St. John Cassian, who had gone from France and Spain down into Egypt, spent 7 years there, came back, and the way of educating young monks in Egypt was was Plato's way. It was the Christian paideia. And this was what then formed the basis of the medieval education that the Irish monks practiced, because St. Patrick was educated in Auxerre, for example, where Cassian had been. And then in the 800s, when you have Alfred the Great with his great revival in England, he sends to Ireland for teachers because the English Latinists are so bad. And you get Charlemagne in Paris and in the Sorbonne and in Aachen, and he sends for Irish monks too. So the odd thing was when I say education goes back to Egypt, it really is incredible that civilization has come from the Middle East several times. You know, we talk about the Fertile Crescent in the Mesopotamia and the Babylonians and the Greeks and so on, but even in the Christian era, this tradition, which in France people just associate with 19th century England, is actually an Egyptian one.
I'm so happy that you expanded on that. A couple things. My patron saint is Catherine of Alexandria. And,
Wow.
She was martyred after converting 200 philosophers. She was she was a teenager, a beautiful teenage girl. And
I bet she was educated at the Catechetical School of Alexandria.
So yes, and she was a brilliant rhetorician and used that gift to share the gospel and convert 200 experts, philosophers. And then we have Saint Athanasius from Alexandria, who wrote the beautiful work on the Incarnation. And so I'm really thrilled to hear you talk about Alexandria. We have a lot of great, you're right, a lot of great Christian saints, church fathers coming out of there.
Sure.
I really appreciate you talking about Christian paideia. And I know that some of our listeners are new to classical education and really just don't even know what paideia is. So can you explain to them what paideia is and perhaps maybe the difference of Plato's paideia and then our Christian-based paideia?
Well, I'm not a great philosopher. I'm more of a doer than a thinker, but I'm a great reader. So I would say that. Well, okay. Now you're Orthodox and I'm Catholic, so here's something that I think probably we'll both chime with. It has been said to me, I don't know how true this is, that Catholics and Orthodox, in so much as they have the same language of grace, would say that grace perfects nature, whereas some strict Protestants would say grace supplants nature. And I would say that the educational tradition that Plato left was almost there, really. that it was waiting for Christ to perfect it. It was very much like St. Paul preaching to the Greeks at the altar of the unknown God. That the Greeks were in a state of expectancy, and that the way that the soil, Jesus Christ probably spoke Greek. Galilee was part of the Greek world. The Christian writings are all in Greek, aren't they? I would say that the difference between the Christian Paideia and Plato is Christ.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But the idea of the transcendentals of goodness, beauty, and truth, the idea of man reaching for God and God reaching out for man, is very pertinent, and also the idea that physics comes before metaphysics. That the whole Aristotelian way of looking at the senses and learning through the senses and moving from the world that we can see and the things that moving step by step in a way that reason can then support propositions about to do with faith. Mm-hmm. That there is no disconnect, that our faith can enlighten our reason. And I think that Clement of Alexandria's idea of a proper education was a complete education. Mm. And the idea in the early church was, the Greeks had that sorted, that the church was not against science, wasn't against learning. The church was actually very keen to be at the heart of it. Just like St. Augustine, for all St. Augustine was setting up the city of God against the old Roman order, he was really actually an example of how the old order flowed into the new, and how the kind of education that the Greeks were dispensing was preparing for Christ. And in some Eastern churches, they even have icons of Socrates and Plato, don't they?
Yep, that's true. That's true.
Ferdi, one of the things that I really like about you is that you are, let's say, to borrow a phrase from Newman, someone who is deep in history. And as you said, that comes through your reading, but I think it also comes through your practice. And you don't strike me as someone who just sort of longs for some return to some golden age, let's say, as if there were ever such a thing. But you seem to glean these golden things from the past, these things that need to be preserved and need to be brought into the current conversation and the current institutions of education, and frankly, the current lives of men, women, and children today through education. And I love what you say about a complete education. And I would love this conversation to sort of aim, as we move forward, to hearing about some of the ways that you do just that, offer a complete education for the students that attend your school. And part of that, and perhaps on the way to that, I'd love to hear a bit more about your thoughts relevant to the life of prayer. And as I recall, something you've used in a talk before, this idea of a school without a chapel being like an angel without wings. Maybe you could tell us the origin of that quote and talk about what it means to you as an educator.
Well, it's from a book called Godliness and Good Learning, which by David Newsome, who's famous for a book on the convert cardinals, on Manning and Newman, but he's also a Victorian church historian of some repute and renown. And he just recounts an anecdote of two Anglican clergymen talking about plans for a new school, and the phrase comes up: a college without a chapel is like an angel without wings. Mm-hmm. That goes back to what I was saying about there was one very humble Anglican clergyman in the middle of the 19th century who saw an opportunity in the wake of the Industrial Revolution of a middle class that was growing up without any real religious influence. And he wanted to create schools for them. And his school that he created was Lancing College, which has the biggest chapel of any school in the world, I think. Mm-hmm. It looks like an enormous cathedral. And this was... how can I put it? I mean, well, in fact, when we're talking about balance, one of the things that I say to teachers when they come to join our school, we talk about a document. It's not a scriptural document. It's a Catholic document from the Vatican II, actually, called Gravissimum Educationis, where it talks about what are the key points of an education. And it's very classical, although it doesn't say much about sport and gymnastics, but it does say that that a good education should be broad. Mm-hmm. So it shouldn't be like a Christian madrasa where you're just learning the scriptures. It should be broad. It should be deep. So you should be learning more than magazine knowledge. You should be learning about the nature of things and things that you couldn't learn just from reading a magazine. So it should be broad and it should be deep. It should also be of high quality, because a Christian seeks perfection, and it should also contain a formation of in morality, so that young people would not just do good but choose the good. Mm-hmm. And lastly, it said that they should be taught how to pray, and that would be very much our blueprint, really. That wish list, if you like.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. When you're looking at bringing teachers in to help get on board for that sort of vision, what qualities do you look for in a teacher in order to put together a faculty that can offer an education that meets those qualities that you just listed?
I would say that probably the most important thing in a teacher, it can be straightened out if you haven't got it, but the most important thing in a teacher is that he or she should have had good teachers. And that is a problem in a society that's in certain places trying to rebuild itself. So I mean, we have had, for example, in the past, some very good teachers from the States, precisely because the revival in classical education in the States is something current, and whereas it's a big thing, whereas in the UK it's a patchy thing, really, and probably the best educated people in Britain come from the expensive private sector, which is increasingly godless. So you won't necessarily find the right kind of people there. But I think that the best teacher training is to have had good teachers yourself. So I would say that's the first thing we look for, actually. Does this person look like they've had a positive experience of education themselves, which then they can perpetuate? What other qualities? Well, I mean, prayerfulness, because I think you have to be a person of prayer teaching, particularly in a boarding school, otherwise you'll crack. Because teaching does require a strong psychological makeup, I would say. So it's not for the fragile.
Oh, that's true. That's very true.
And also, I mean, children expect you to be the same every day. It's so comforting for them, if you can be like that for them. And I often have to say this to parents as well when and they're asking for some sort of advice, and I say, well, look, children expect adults to be like walls. When they push the wall, they don't expect it to move. And that gives them security. So teachers who are mercurial and unpredictable really are terribly difficult to deal with. So it doesn't mean that teachers should be boring. You want them to have a big box of tricks, but you need to be pretty robust. So robustness, and also having had a good experience of education, I'd say, and being prayerful, because it's that prayer life that gives the teacher then a kind of source of strength and resituates them in what they're supposed to be doing. That it's also about reflection, being able to stand back from what you're doing.
I'm curious, what does your teacher formation look like? How do you feed your teachers? How do you form them? What kind of things do you have them read? What do your meetings look like?
No. Well, I would say we're probably, compared to what you guys probably do in the States, we are a bit anarchical. I mean, in English private schools, when I was at school myself in the 80s, and I know they were like this in the 90s and about the time I started the school, I went back and did part-time, dividing my time between France and England, teacher training myself. So I could see how things were working in private schools in the UK still then. Quite often, a brilliant graduate would come out of university, somebody who'd had a good education themselves at school, and they'd be handed a book and just put in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
And expected to dispense the kind of education that they themselves had dispensed. Now, we're not quite that bad, but we would be very careful about choosing some, we would only choose people who knew their stuff. So we would tend to favour, graduates of good universities like Oxford and Cambridge, for example. In our staff meetings, what do we talk about? Well, I would say that we talk a lot about, this might make your stomach turn, inclusivity, in the sense that we're always looking out to see, is there any child being left behind?
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's kind of a buzzword in the UK at the moment, inclusivity. But what I mean by that is that, is there anybody who's going slower than the others? Is there anyone who needs extra support? Is there anyone who might seem that they're bullied, needs some extra sort of attention? So that's certainly something that comes up in staff meetings. Our staff, that we all go to daily mass, so we're praying together. We do have some readings that we do in pedagogy. So they might be people like John Senior, for example. Also classics, like there's somebody called Brother Agathon who has wrote a book called the 12 Virtues of a Good Catholic Christian Teacher. We've a number of resources that we share often each year with new teachers from an organization in the States called NAPCIS. I don't know if you know it, I don't know if it exists anymore, but there's also a number of Vatican documents on lay Catholics in schools, Catholic school on the threshold of the third millennium, and also particularly Pius XI's encyclical Divini Ilius Magistri, that divine teacher from the 1920s, where it's the first time really the Catholic Church is addressing the question of what should a Catholic school be doing in the modern world. Mm-hmm. And he makes the point too that a Catholic school is not just, shall we say, Bible bashing. A Catholic school, what makes a good Catholic baker is he makes good bread. So, yes. It should be about giving children a good education. And interestingly, and we talk about this a lot because we talk about the questions of, whether our education should be more or less child-centered. Mm-hmm. And that's something there's a tension there, mm-hmm. And we discuss this amongst ourselves because we have scouts in the school, for example. We're interested in the pedagogy of Baden-Powell, particularly as it's translated into Catholic scouting in the 20s in France, after Jacques Sevin. And then the whole pedagogy of the Charlier brothers, which is very similar, really. It's to do with evincing a sense of responsibility in teenagers so that they can become leaders of younger boys. That was very much what André Charlier did. And also this contact with real life, real nature, physical endeavor, a taste for exertion and effort and all that sort of thing.
Yes.
But actually, Pius XI in the 20s was warning against a wave of naturalism coming into education. So there is a debate there, there is a debate in how much authority can you give to children. We give boys authority in the school, by the way. So, we have 16 or 17-year-olds who might be supervising studies or, with some sort of level of delegation, might be putting the younger boys to bed, and then we would give them instructions and check on them and that kind of thing. We would have them running debate clubs or games or different things like that. I think, and there's a system of houses and house captains and so on, which is all kind of reinforced with lots of checks and balances. So inside the school, we have houses. I mean, after COVID now, our numbers have shrunk from about 50 down to 30, 33. So the school is kind of teetering here at the moment. But with 4 houses, there are 8 boys in each house. And those houses are run by the house captain. But there's also a house master or a house mistress who keeps an eye on what's going on. So I'd say that we, I don't know. I mean, that I don't know what the place of that would be in your American classical education movement. The empowerment of student leadership is something that's very much part of the 19th century English revival in education. It has its place in Jesuit education in the 16th and 17th centuries. They had captains and generals and so on in classes. But,
well, if I could jump in here for a minute, Ferdi, I think I could speak to that just briefly, and afterwards, I'd like to ask a question on behalf of a teacher who finds him or herself in, let's say, a typical school in the States. You mentioned John Sr., and to my knowledge, he's it's a fairly short list of folks like him that we have to draw from. And so we not only sort of suffer from a lack of, let's say, educational fathers in that vein, but also just even our environment is not, we just haven't been around as long as even your village has. And so there's a lack of history there too. And so I wonder, it seems to me that the encouragement for teachers to read, to be deep in history, to do as I've noticed Adrian does, to just return to the sources, and to know that this movement, I'd say, Adrian, correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, it's something like 25, 30 years old in the States. And so it's still extremely young. And I think one of the things that, one of the markers, let's say, that I've noticed is that a lot of schools have adopted sort of this mere Christianity model that comes from the good work of C.S. Lewis. But of course, that's created a lot of schools that are in some ways, by necessity, operating in the hallway, to use his analogy. And when I look at your school, I see a school that is very, very much stepping into the fullness of the room. That
I know exactly what you mean. Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. I mean, C.S. Lewis. There's a man who had a terrible experience of education. If you've read his *Surprised by Joy*, I mean, he was at horrible schools, and and in fact, Baden Powell is another person who wasn't happy at school. So there are tensions there. But it's true that certainly it was part of my idea. My idea here in Chavannes was the 19th century idea of the school with its chapel, with a certain amplitude, big refectory. You know, that this was all part of the idea from day one. Perhaps it was a little bit hubristic, but there we go. That was the idea, and we're here, and we've been here for 20 years. And it's true that a lot of the efforts that you have in the States, they're great people, but they're small. Maybe they're just, they're small, but they're successful. They're not objectively any smaller than we are. We're a small school too. We just have a big, grand building with a bit of a history behind it. I'd love us to have a couple of hundred pupils, but it hasn't happened.
Sure.
And there aren't very many classical schools with a boarding element that get past 40 or 50 pupils, really, in the world.
Right.
Well, I think in terms of feasibility and viability of this kind of education, John Senior, you mentioned John Senior. He seems to anticipate that. I mean, he in his book that you've seen now, sort of privately circulated book about his ideal school.
Yeah.
He anticipates that you'd have 5 or 6 teachers who would be friends, who would come together as a community of faith, and they would have daily mass, and they would pray together, and they would be friends, and then they would set up a school with no pupils at all, and then see if anybody comes. and that kind of school would never have more than 40 or 50.
Yes.
And you're getting painfully close to Rousseau's Émile, who sort of teaches himself with a tutor who arranges experiences for him and puts the right books out for him to find, and so on. This kind of education where you have one teacher for 10, you have 5 or 6 teachers, possibly 10 teachers or more for 50 kids, is never going to educate the world unless you have an awful lot of people involved in education. So, I mean, there's a big tension there. We had, in the first year of the school, the first 7 years, we had a Christian brother here, retired guy who's died now, passed away, lovely man, Brother Moylan, Australian. And he joined the Christian Brothers when he was 15. And he had his first class of 70 when he was 19.
Wow.
And they managed to give them a good education.
Yeah. Well,
and that kind of education that they gave them was nothing like the education that your schools or my school dispense now.
Well, it does seem to me, and this is just my observation, that we are at an inflection point, because it makes sense that as teachers would continue to read and be deep in history, that they would come across these examples of those who have gone before us, and they would have this desire to again step into that spirit that they so embodied. Many of them up against as much, if not more, problems and forces politically and otherwise working against them. I'm delighted to hear about the sort of the community that you find yourself in that lends so much support to what you're doing at Chavannes. And I just wonder if I could ask a question on behalf of the teacher who finds him or herself at a school that is doing good work, and yet, let's say this person has been reading these books you've mentioned, or comes across your school and falls in love with the vision and just desires to do more and to go deeper, and I just wonder, other than to continue reading, what sort of encouragement might you have for a teacher who says, I don't have a wonderful historical setting with the beautiful white cows and the leaky roof, as it were. But still, I'd take that if I could have sort of this environment. I find myself in the middle of the city that seems so bent against me. What sort of encouragement would you have for the educator who finds him or herself in that position?
Well, there was a poet laureate in England in the 19th century called Robert Southey, who wrote this lovely poem called The Scholar. And it's about keeping company with the dead. I would say that we can all be discouraged, and I'm sometimes discouraged here.
Sure.
So, and what I do is I pray, but also I read. And I would say that kind of, I mean, you said it yourself, that it's not a form of escapism. It's a form of enracination, binding ourselves to our forefathers. It's a new kind of Lectio Divina, really, because it's about for our generation of people who kind of felt that we caught the tail end of the old culture but didn't get it completely. We're always making up for our lack of formation and lack of knowledge, so that that we can transmit it more perfectly. And
boy, that's so true.
You look at, I'm not an expert on this woman, but you know that Marva Collins, back in the 50s or something, there was an African-American lady who was starting up schools that were teaching Shakespeare and grammar and times tables when everyone else was learning by the syllabic method how to read and that kind of thing. Are you familiar with her, Marva Collins?
No,
I don't believe so.
Well, Marva Collins, there's a film called The Marva Collins Story. But anyway, she started up schools in the 60s, 70s, where mostly black children from underprivileged areas in the States were just taught the classics. She's perhaps in the line of people like E.D. Hirsch. You know E.D. Hirsch, who says, that's this idea of the core knowledge, you shouldn't teach skills, you should teach the good literature and the good culture and history, and that will engender and evince the skills in the kids afterwards. So she's very much in that line. It's just teach the 3 R's and the children will excel. And this is what E.D. Hirsch is doing, school district by school district in the States. There is a movement outside of classical Christian revival. There's a movement across the States that people like Hirsch are pushing, which is bringing back content as opposed to just vague project work, bringing back content and structure and progression in the public school system, and bringing back a common culture. Of course, the problem then is, how to curate that culture. And of course, people will, that's where the next battle's going to be. I think people will be keen on children being able to read good literature and difficult books and difficult mathematics and so on. Well, that's what parents want everywhere. It's certainly happening in Britain. I mean, that's coming back in schools. But what's happening now is it's being re-curated. Do you know what I mean by that?
I'd like you to expand a little more, because I like where you're going.
Well, what they're saying is that, okay, we accept that children need to be challenged at school. They need to be stretched. They need their horizons expanded. They need to be enriched, situating themselves in time and space, learning about history and literature and so on. But we need to redress the wrongs of our colonial past and our sexist institutions and all this sort of thing by re-curating the history and the literature that we teach them.
Sure.
And then also, we might just when was the last time this was done? I mean, it was done in Nazi Germany, wasn't it? And it was done in communist Russia, where they believed in stretching the children, but they rewrote the textbooks. You see, so that's what's happening in Britain now. People are and it could be happening in the States too. So Mark Twain gets dropped from the syllabus because it's racist, and
Right.
things like that. I'm not an expert on American literature, but
Ferdi, you mentioned Baden-Powell, and on your recommendation, I went and purchased his guide to scouting, and just so enjoyed it. Shared it with the headmaster at my school here, and our school in so many ways is very well. We do some of those things just because a lot of it's just common sense, good, clean living, and it's interesting. I was speaking with Adrian just the other day that you could take a model like that, well, as Hitler did, and you could replicate it without the things that make it good, true, and beautiful. And there you go. You've got the Hitler Youth.
That's right, and that's what's going to happen with schools in the future. Now that the argument about content and skills is being won by people like Hirsch, that we are going to get content back in our schools, mainly because there's such a strong emphasis on mathematics and technology. So people have to have a brain now. But the cultural content that they're going to be taught is being skewed. I mean, maybe that's another argument for, I don't know whether I can get away with saying this, but small schools that can kind of get under the radar. I mean, handing on the best that has been thought and said.
Yes.
Use the expression of Thomas Arnold's son, Matthew, without getting into trouble for it.
Well, if I could add too, and I think this will just bring us back full circle to the importance of the spiritual life in the life of a school. A school that is willing to commit itself to things that now are seemed quite old-fashioned, prayer and fasting. Some of these demons, some of these cultural demons, will only be driven out, seems to me, with prayer and fasting, as Christ told his disciples when they came up against things that they wrestled against.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, and the family that's prays together stays together, And I think another thing to also is aspects of common life. We're not monks, neither are you, but eating together is important for teachers, I think. It's not just a question of supervising the children.
Yes.
If you're actually sitting next to someone, breaking bread with somebody, discussing with them, sharing with them.
True companionship.
Yeah. I mean, the conviviality, a convivium is a meal, so that's where it comes from. So
that's good.
Well, one other thing I'd like to ask before we get to our closing question is, tell us a little bit about why you think it's really important to sing to your children in class.
Well, I think, well, there are a few different reasons. One of them is it gets their attention. And also, I mean, in a way, as a headmaster, as the person in charge of the school, I set the tone of the school. So many of the faults of the school are my own, and many of the positive points of the school might come from me too. And I have a reputation for quite frequently breaking into song, and that kind of gets the boys doing it as well. And they feel less self-conscious. But I don't know. I mean, you put me on the spot. Is there a profound reason for? I mean, I think it's to do with being joyful, isn't it? Music and laughter should be part of a school, and I think and also it goes back to my own experience of my youth, that when I was at school, I remember my teachers at school, who were mostly male teachers, was a big school of about 1,000 boys, about 50 or 60 teachers. They would all sing their hymns gustily, and they would sing tenor and bass parts from the hymn book. Most of the teachers, even science teachers, would play the violin or the organ or the piano or what have you. And I think we need to, model that way of being to the children. But it's mainly about being joyful. Mm-hmm. And it's Baden-Powell says it himself. It's in the Scout Law. In the English Scout Law, Baden-Powell says that a scout whistles under all difficulties. Mm-hmm. But in the French version, the Catholic version, Father Sevin says that a scout sings and smiles with all difficulties. Uh-huh. So you can certainly, by singing and smiling, you can make yourself joyful and other people joyful too.
Yes, much like St. Paul and who was it that he was imprisoned with, where they were singing hymns.
Yeah, that's right. Mm-hmm. Although we don't always sing hymns. I mean, sometimes it could be a Robert Burns song or Irish folk song or something.
Well, right before we're going to ask you one more question, and then when we close the podcast, we will be featuring an excerpt of one of your songs that you sang that you posted on the internet. Unless you'd like to break out into song now, we could do that if you want to. But I know you have a cold, so if you're not comfortable, so we'll put a recording of you singing a spot from one of your pieces that you've done. But I would like to close by asking you to think about or share a favorite quote from either, a poem, a song, a book, a speech, anything, something that's very dear to your heart and that has had an impact on you.
Well, that's a big question. I would say that that when you're in a position of leadership, which any kind of education is about, that you need to be prepared to change. And it's very difficult for anybody who gets involved in anything like politics or any kind of activism or something like that, and they come to it with passion and convictions. I'm speaking from my own experience here. It's very difficult to admit you're wrong and reassess both your motives and your methods without selling out on your convictions or losing your passion. And there's a phrase from Newman which is quite frequently quoted by people from the left and the right. To live is to change, and to have lived well is to have changed often. And I think that can be abused, but I think it's very, very true that unless we're prepared to be changed, then we can't change others. So that would be my little quote that I try to live by.
Quite true. Well, Ferdi, I knew going into this conversation that it would be an encouragement and just very rich. Thank you for reading. Thank you for leading your school. And thank you for being an example to us all. And please pray for us.
And likewise, do the same for us. Hands of Prayer joined across the Atlantic. And God bless you in all your educational endeavors. It's been very, very great privilege for me to get to know you over the internet. I hope to see you in person one day.
Thank you so much. This was a treat.
God bless.
Come, let us thank the God of earth and heaven for England's Son and priest of steadfast heart, John Henry Newman, who for truth resplendent shunned worldly fame for the both fixed upon thee. Thy kindly light did follow to the end. Now let us pray for grace to follow after him who named thee boldly Master and Friend. Praise God the Father, Lord of all creation, and praise the Son, whose death has set us free, and Holy Spirit, three in one forever. Help heart, speak to heart, till all rest in thee.
Thank you so much for listening. We invite you to experience the art of teaching through interactive learning communities at our Patreon page. Visit patreon.com/classical education. Also, be sure to join the conversation on our Facebook community at facebook.com/groups/classical education. We are a listener-supported podcast, so your support makes this podcast possible. As the great artist and educator John Ruskin once wrote, "Well, my friends, the final result of the education I want you to give your children will be, in a few words, this: they will know what it is to see the sky, they will know what it is to breathe it, and they will know, best of all, what it is to behave under it, as in the presence of a Father who is in heaven."